We're going to be taking a look at Diddy and, some pretty heavy allegations that have been made against him.
Yeah.
And we have some pretty interesting stuff to go over today, so I'm excited to kind of unpack it all with you.
I am too.
So
it's going to be interesting.
Yeah, so I guess to give everyone kind of a quick overview of what we're going to be looking at, we have some excerpts here from an interview with Amber Rose that she did on the Club Shay podcast.
Yeah.
And in it, she kind of talks about, Diddy and his parties and stuff like that, which everyone knows he's very well known for his parties.
Right, yeah. He's, a staple in that scene, for sure, for decades.
Yeah, for a very long time, like since the 90s, I think.
Oh, yeah,
so,
at least.
Yeah. So anyway, she talks about that, and then also we're going to be looking at some of the information that came from federal prosecutors in New York who are making these allegations against Diddy.
Right.
So I think, our mission today is really to kind of look at these two different narratives that are coming out.
Right.
And, try to see what we can make of them and, how they relate to each other and also what it might tell us about, like, power dynamics and consent and stuff like that.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, I guess without further ado, let's just kind of jump right in.
Yeah, let's get into it.
Okay, so in this interview with Amber Rose, she's talking about how she's been going to Diddy's parties for a very long time.
Yeah.
Like she said, since 2000 and...
Yeah, so over a decade.
Like a very long time. Yeah, and she talked about how, she went to all these different parties of his famous white parties.
Right, yeah, those are iconic.
But she said she's never been to or even heard of something called a freak-off.
Right.
Which is what these federal prosecutors are calling these gatherings, where all this alleged, stuff happened.
Yeah, so these freak-offs are now at the center of this case, and her saying that she's never heard of them, that's pretty significant.
It's very strange.
Yeah. It's odd.
Like, you would think if something like that was going on and she was in that scene, like, she would at least heard of it, right?
Yeah, especially if it was something that was happening somewhat regularly. You would think word would get around.
Yeah, exactly. And she's like, she's a pretty prominent figure in that scene.
Right.
Like, it's not like she's some, random person who wouldn't know what's going on.
Yeah, she's well connected. She runs in those circles, so it's not like she's just totally out of the loop.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So it's very strange that she would have no knowledge of this whatsoever.
Yeah, and that's kind of what makes this whole thing so intriguing, is that you have these allegations from these federal prosecutors who are saying that these freak-offs were like a regular thing.
Right.
And then you have someone like Amber Rose who's saying, I've never even heard of that.
Yeah, it's like, well, which one is it?
Exactly. And so I think it's really important to look at both sides of this and to consider all the possibilities.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's even more interesting because she said that she talked to Ray J about it.
Oh, yeah.
And he had no idea what she was talking about either.
Right.
Like, he was just as surprised as her.
Yeah, he was like, what are you talking about?
Yeah, like he was just completely clueless.
Yeah.
So it's like, okay, if these two people who were both very much in that scene had no idea that this was going on, then what does that tell us?
Right. Does that mean that it wasn't happening? Or does it mean that it was happening, but it was like a super secret thing?
Yeah, or maybe it was only happening with a very specific group of people.
Yeah, that's possible too. Like maybe there was like a whole inner circle that was involved in this and nobody else knew about it.
Yeah, and I think that's something that we really need to consider as we're looking at this case, is that, there could be a lot more going on behind the scenes than we realize.
Absolutely.
Like there could be all these hidden dynamics and relationships and stuff that we're not aware of.
Yeah, and I think that's something that's really important to keep in mind whenever we're dealing with any kind of allegations like this, is that there's always more to the story than what we see on the surface.
Right, there's always more to it. And, just because we don't know about something doesn't mean that it's not happening.
Yeah, exactly.
And just because someone says that something didn't happen doesn't mean that it didn't happen.
Great, and I think it's also important to remember that, people's memories are fallible.
Yeah.
Like sometimes people just don't remember things correctly.
Or maybe they're choosing not to remember.
Yeah, that's possible too.
So, we have to be really careful about not jumping to conclusions.
Absolutely.
And we need to make sure that we're considering all sides of the story.
Yeah, and I think that's what we're trying to do here, is to just kind of lay out all the information that we have.
Right.
And to let people come to their own conclusions.
Yeah, and I think that's really all we can do at this point.
Yeah.
So, okay, let's talk about these allegations a little bit more specifically. So like I said, these federal prosecutors in New York are accusing Diddy of orchestrating these freak-offs.
Right.
And they're saying that these gatherings involved, drugging and coercion and potentially non-consensual sexual activity.
Yeah, and they're alleging that this happened over a period of several years.
Yeah, like a long time.
Yeah, and that there were multiple victims.
Yeah, so this is like very, very serious stuff.
Yeah, it's extremely serious, and, the fact that it's being investigated by federal prosecutors means that they believe that they have a strong case.
Yeah, and Diddy is actually facing charges of sex trafficking.
Right.
Which I think a lot of people don't really understand what that means.
Yeah, it's a very specific legal term.
Yeah, so can you kind of break that down for us a little bit?
Sure. So basically, sex trafficking involves exploiting someone for sexual acts through force, fraud, or coercion.
Okay.
So it doesn't necessarily have to involve, like, transporting someone across state lines or anything like that. It can just be like, using your power or your influence to force someone into doing something sexual that they don't want to do.
Okay, I see.
And so in this case, the prosecutors are alleging that Diddy used his position and his wealth and his influence to coerce these women into participating in these freak-offs.
Okay.
And they're saying that he did this by, plying them with drugs and alcohol, and by threatening them, and by basically just creating an environment where they felt like they couldn't say no.
Wow.
Yeah. Pretty heavy stuff.
It's really intense, and like you said before, this is not something to be taken lightly.
Absolutely not. I mean, these are incredibly serious charges, and if he's convicted, he could face a very lengthy prison sentence.
Yeah, and of course, Diddy is denying all of this.
Right. He's maintaining his innocence.
Yeah, he's saying that all of the activities that took place at these gatherings were consensual.
Right. He's saying that everyone was there of their own free will, and that nobody was forced into doing anything that they didn't want to do.
Right. And his legal team is going to have to present a very strong defense to refute these charges.
Yeah, absolutely. They're going to have to come up with some pretty compelling evidence to convince a jury that he's not guilty.
And this whole thing is set to go to trial in May, so it's going to be very interesting to see how it all plays out.
Yeah, it's going to be a high-profile trial for sure.
For sure. So it's definitely something that we're going to be keeping an eye on.
Yeah, we'll have to revisit this for sure.
So, okay, like you said earlier, we have these allegations from the prosecutors.
Right.
And then we have these statements from Amber Rose and Ray J saying that they were never invited to these freak-offs.
Right.
And so, like we said before, it's kind of like a puzzle.
Yeah.
Like, how do we reconcile these two seemingly contradictory narratives?
Yeah, it's tough.
And I think that's kind of the big question that we're left with here is like, what does this all mean?
Yeah, what does it tell us about Diddy and about the people around him and about the whole culture of celebrity and wealth and power?
Right. And I think that's one of the things that makes this case so fascinating is that it really does raise some big questions about power dynamics and consent.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like, how much power did Diddy have over these women?
Right.
And how much were they really able to consent to what was happening?
Yeah. And I think those are questions that we're going to have to grapple with as a society as we continue to see more and more cases like this come to light.
Yeah, for sure. And it's not an easy conversation to have.
No, it's not.
But I think it's a really important one.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, I guess just to kind of wrap things up here, I think it's important to remember that these are just allegations at this point.
Right.
And Diddy is innocent until proven guilty.
Yeah.
So we need to be careful about not jumping to conclusions.
Yeah. And we need to let the legal process play out.
Right. And ultimately, it's up to a jury to decide whether or not he's guilty of these charges.
That's right.
So, I think it's important for all of us to kind of step back and just observe and see what happens.
Yeah. And to try to keep an open mind.
Yeah. And to be willing to consider all sides of the story.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, I think that's about all we have time for today.
Yeah.
But this is definitely a story that we're going to be following very closely.
Absolutely.
So make sure you stay tuned for updates.
Yeah, we'll keep you posted.
All right, everybody. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for joining us.
And we'll catch you next time.
See ya.
Bye.